Hello everybody, welcome back. This week's tutorial is going to be a little bit self-serving as far as the grandiose themes go, but this is something that I've been working on for quite a while, and I felt as though this is a tutorial that needed to be said, and there could be some stuff learned from it. So, what I'm going to be doing is showing how to draw the Luvalopes, which is a species that I've been working on for, I don't know, probably a couple months or something like that. It's slowly working on. But they're just really tall, really lanky, really awkwardly shaped rabbits is the best way to describe them, with a kind of a tear torn out of their ear is how I've been describing it, but I guess you can kind of say it however you want. Now I'm doing a video on this, even though I've already done a written tutorial, but this written tutorial only really talked about like pose work stuff, little artist things that you can do, like teeth or no teeth, like why they would wear clothing, or why wouldn't they, things like that, and then like some slight changes between the genders as well, which by the way, I don't know if anyone caught, generally hair on the males while no hair on the females, but that is interchangeable. That is okay to have hair on females and no hair on males. That was something that I kind of left there just for people to notice. But I've been working on these for a while, and I even Zhao even allowed me to make a full ref for the level I had made for her called Fayette. So this was a great opportunity to kind of learn what I needed to do, and this block here ended up turning into this tutorial, but this tutorial ended up not having all the information I wanted to say. So ultimately, I'm going to be going more in depth on this tutorial, where I'm actually going to be talking more about the anatomy on the Luvalopes themselves, and kind of explaining why things look the way they look, and so that maybe you could adapt them into your own style a bit easier, since some people were having some problems. So I'm not going to start on this side. I'm actually going to work over here for the most part. I spent a good amount of time kind of designing their skeleton. This is a rather rough take of it. This won't be like an end-all be-all, but I felt as though this would be really useful in explaining how this stuff works. So this skeleton is rather sloppily done as far as skeletons go. Like, I only have one pose from the straight side, and then one different pose of the head, and a frontal view of the pelvis, just because those things were what was important to actually note, and this gives all the information I want to share. So the first things first is only 4 fingers. Not a lot of people have done 5 fingers, but I felt as though that was something worth noting. They only have 4 fingers, but they're incredibly like large, fat fingers, as I pointed out over here on this on the Fayette ref. They're absolutely like huge fingers, but they only have 3. But as we go detailed onto the skull is pretty much a rabbit skull, but with larger eyes on them. And that's just to accommodate the larger form of emotions, and more muscle mass can be fit inside of here as to how they are able to form emotion, as opposed to a rabbit, which, rabbits don't have eyebrows. That's a perfect example. As we go down, their spine actually curves a lot. They have a lot of flexibility in this, so they can get into really crazy poses, and I don't know, the rabbits, they're going to be jumping around and things. But normal human spines will bend pretty much like this, as opposed to this absolutely extreme curvature going to it. And while they have a tailbone, this doesn't mean that they have a tail. Tailbones are actually used for muscle connections. You can find these in the human body as well, but humans don't have working tails, so that kind of proves my point there. I put a spot as to where the ball joints would attach. This I purposely put this in here because this would cover up just everything over here, so I detached the arm for the sakes of this. The feet were interesting. The feet are an interesting thing. This is a subject that I didn't think about until I was making this skeleton, but they have and I was probably annoying the hell out of people trying to figure this out, but they have a very long foot, basically, is how it's going to work. With kind of very short lower leg is how you would kind of look at it. The end result is going to be pretty much a normal standard leg, But if I were to grab this, I think it's this, yep, this, and move it over to show you. So why the shape? Why the skeletons the way they have it? So very long bone up here, which is normal. That's what you'll find right here. And the very long foot is just so that you can have this angle here. So why the shape of the legs here? So the reason why we have such long feet for them and this tiny short bone is for this angle right here. Like this angle is exactly why we have this system in place. And that may sound very strange, but the purpose is that, say this bone is here. This whole shape makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, except when you account for the fact that there's this bone jutting out and sticking straight down, and these are all your feet, your like toe bones basically. So this takes into account this very large shape, and this takes into account this angle as well, kind of jutting out from the back, since this bone juts back slightly and will oftentimes be put outwards just a little bit so that they have better balance standing on wherever they are. Since they are rabbits, they're going to have to be standing and keeping their balance where they want. It also leads to some very interesting effects where you can have their legs kind of folding upwards like this and then immediately jutting out again. Now, if it's jutting out like this, that means that they won't be flat-bottomed, so they'll actually have a much more rounded look to them. It will look a lot closer to a rabbit's feet. I just didn't make that rounded at all. But they'll end up being a lot more rabbit-shaped. They also only have 3 toes, like 3 massive toes, which goes in line with their 3 massive hands. They have 3 hands now. No, they're 3 massive fingers. So that's the way that their legs are shaped. For the most part, they can be drawn fairly normal. Whoop, let's actually put that one back. For the most part, they can be drawn fairly normal. It's just a case of understanding that the bottoms are a lot wider than they really should be, and they kind of go into this wide shape. They don't just suddenly become wide at the bottom. So, working our way up from there, the spine is where people have a lot of issues with. Not the spine, the waist. The waist is where people have a lot of issues with, and it took a long time for me to figure out how to explain how this system works properly. But the best way to explain the way that the chest goes into the spine is the chest is just like this shape like this, fairly average shape you can find for a chest. But the waist is basically a tube of nothingness that goes into the hips. And it's kind of strange describing it like that, but while there is like muscle mass and stuff in here, there's nothing else going on. Like under normal circumstances, your rib cage would be like, obviously much more on top of your pelvis, and it would, you'd have stuff in here like abdomen and like guts and things like that. Luvalopes don't really have that. In terms of keeping their flexibility and their insaneness in that regard, they don't have anything in this regard. And obviously they have like tooth and shit going through here, but most of that is actually contained up here. So they're very anemic in this regard, where they don't have, just a lot of mass. But that also means that their pelvis is also very anemic in that regard as well. I kind of started that shape a little bit early. But the way that this works is it kind of curves into the flesh along here, and it kind of loops around, and your leg shows up here. So that's your leg shape. But this is where the top of the pelvis, the top of your hips are, pelvis bones. So really your hips end up being this kind of square shape along the side that go into the front, and the flesh around the waist kind of folds into that as well. Now I have this view from the side just to kind of show that the hips are super wide. The way I imagine it is that to help compensate for all of this and for their kind of rather massive size and kind of oblong shape, they probably have more things in their pelvis than normal, like a lot of more things in this area than they would normally have. So it's much wider to help accommodate. But because it's wider, that leaves a little bit of awkwardness with the way the legs are, because the legs, by comparison, are a lot more inwards. Now, just so people know, this bone is literally like two different bones that are fused right in the middle and fused to a different bone along the back. It's kind of funny when I see them drawn as like one massive shape instead. It's like, no, this thing's really complicated, really annoying to draw. Anyways, so what this ends up looking like is it kind of fades out as it goes forwards. The spine, the waist area kind of disappears as it goes forwards. But the hips flare out really, really widely. And they kind of slope down and flow out because having a sudden jarring shape going sideways is very, very awkward to see and to draw, especially when they're supposed to be these like flexible, loosey-goosey things. So as their pelvis goes out here, obviously the legs are kind of underneath. Made that angle a little bit too extreme. Now, kind of in terms with keeping in terms with how these things are, because the pelvis bones actually slope downwards very extreme, it kind of gives this look as though it's falling forwards. It's like they're kind of tripping forwards all the time. But really, it's just that the bones themselves are tipped forwards, and so the flesh kind of goes with it. A good example of that is to view these things sideways. So when you view these things sideways, it looks like they're running forwards, but really it's just this pelvis bone is kind of tipped forwards anyways, and the spine is kind of attached into it. Ta-da. Look very familiar? That's because this thing is designed. When they're running like this, obviously the bones are working much the same way as this. So I can overlay this same skeleton on top of almost any of these sketches that I have, purely because like it's taken into account the way these things like to be drawn. Speaking of the way these things like to be drawn, let's start working our way a little bit higher up. So as we know how the flesh works along the waistline. Let's take a look at the ribcage a little bit. Ribcage is actually fairly straightforward. It's supposed to be designed a lot like a regular person's ribcage, and lo and behold, that's not super strange. But the clavicle bones along the top here, and these bones are bones that pretty much attach to the. They don't attach, but they rest on the top of your arms. Don't correct me on my anatomy. I'm a little bit rusty on it, but I knew enough to get this done and help trying to explain this. So I don't reference me for anatomy stuff. Anyone who's in like an anatomy class or anything. But this shape that they have is like the pit of the neck, and this shape is supposed to go up with the neck. So to help make the neck easier to draw, you can just imagine it's all flowing straight towards the front of the front of the rib cage. And that point where they meet, you draw off of it, and I will find a drawing from the front. So this point where they meet, you draw off of that point, and that's where you get to the arms. And the arms are supposed to look like they're kind of dislocated. They're jutted off to the side, and not so much like inside the everything else as it's normally designed. So these things kind of go off the edge and turn into a ball. And when they go off the edge and turn into a ball, that is where you attach the arms. Simple, right? And as well, just to help kind of keep this theme going, oftentimes this line that you make is where the fluff is going to be originating from. So this area right above it is actually not going to have as big a fluff as normal, but everything below it will, up until it gets to the bottom of the rib cage where it's not going to be supporting the fluff anymore. So basically, if you look at it from the side, you would have something to the tune of this. And this whole area would just be this massive, fluff ball, basically. And that's how you draw the kind of chest region of the Luvalopes. It's not super complex, super difficult. It's just that it's kind of awkward having this massive mass, a tiny, tiny little mass, and then like a medium-sized mass. They're supposed to be very oblong and awkwardly shaped, so they're fun. They're fun once you kind of get the hang of it, and this is definitely a case where you need to draw them a couple of times to kind of get used to it. I mean, lo and behold, I did. Like, all this was an attempt of me kind of learning how they worked myself, and I made the freaking species. So once you kind of have the hang of it, they are relatively fun to draw. The hands are really simple. The hands themselves are just kind of like the easiest way that I found to draw them is just kind of a massive mitten that goes up into the elbow, and then it kind of continues straight up. Whoop-de-diddly-do. It's not super super crazy the way that this upper area works. But the way to draw the hands is it is kind of a giant mitten that you just break up into shapes. So I did this flat bottom to it. And so you bring up the pinky, you bring up the middle finger, and then you kind of bring out the first finger as well as shaping it. The palm is just kind of a massive shape, and then the thumb is attached to the side. So if we erase some stuff here, straighten that out just slightly, straighten that out, yada yada yada, and if I find this other thing and erase it, you have a very Luvalopes hand. Now you can go through and refine this and kind of say, well, I want this to be the end of the finger, so it's actually going to be looping around like this, which is, you know, perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. And there you go, Luvalopes hand. Now you'll notice that they almost don't have an elbow, only if they're like actually moving their arm pretty far forward. Let me bring up everything just so I know I have it all. But unless you have a pretty extreme turn like here, for the most part the flesh will just kind of want to go straight in a straight line. You may have a little dip like this, but you know, perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. And so the arms are actually supposed to be really simple to draw, where it's just kind of this long tube that you put a hand on the end. You just have to make sure that the end is very, very large as compared to the top of it. It's supposed to be this massive tapering shape that you have. Moving up from there, we have the skull and the head. So the way I drew this was I just found a rabbit skull, and I redrew it, and I redrew it a couple other times and kind of slowly adapted into something I liked. It's still very, very reminiscent of a rabbit skull, but you know, for the sake of tutorial in this will work perfectly fine. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing a rabbit skull. Yep, we're seeing a Luvalopes skull actually. Haha. So this shape along the back is where the fluff kind of originates from. Obviously the fluff is not on a muscle mass, so there's no reason for it to be attached to a bone, but the bone will give shape to this area of the head, and that area of the head is where the fluff is. So aha, there you go, it makes sense. Now at the end of the fluff is where the base of the skull actually is. This is the jaw itself, the mandible. Now up here it kind of jumps back out again, has this little bump along the back, and that's actually where muscles attach and stuff so that it can move its head properly, yada yada. We're not getting into muscle mass because lo and behold, I am not going to be able to draw the muscle mass for this thing. Oh jeez. So we end up having this kind of B shape along the back, but it slopes downwards into the bottom of the jaw. Going up, it's relatively simple, it's just kind of a head shape. And then we get down to the nose. Now the nose protrudes out from the actual snout we have here, not very far, not that far. And then it loops back around. So there's actually a lot of flesh and a lot of like fluffiness to this, instead of just, you know, bone, 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 bone. Because obviously they're fluffy. It makes no sense to have something that's not fluffy. Actually bring this down just slightly more so it's actually, you know, in line with the teeth. And then you have the bottom of the mandible as well, which is the bottom jaw. And then obviously this is the mouth. So if we just kind of throw in a basic mouth there. It goes very far back, but you know, that's fine. It just means they can open up their mouth really wide and just get super, super happy reactions. Aha. So the nose, I left all this room here for a very, very large nose, but it doesn't protrude out very far from the actual face. If you want it to kind of protrude a little bit more, then what you can do is you can kind of start this a little bit behind it, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. That makes the nose protrude out, but it still slopes down into the smile very well. And then the large area for the eye is, you know, the large area for the eye. You just kind of throw the eye in here. This is not scientifically made eye at all, but you know, it's what I do. Now the ears, there isn't like a bone or anything for an ear, even though it's such a huge ear, but it has more than enough muscles attachment to work. So the ears, the way they work is they're just kind of the shape going on to the back. Specifically it's a ball shape. Whoops, sorry, drawing this poorly. Too large of a ball shape, too small of a ball shape. There, perfect. So you have this ball shape, and then you kind of just pull a line off the top of it. Like, it's not rocket science, it's not insanity. You just kind of pull a line off the top of that ball shape, and then it slopes down. Now, their ears are rather huge. Do I have a ratio that I put down in here? No, I must have gotten rid of that. So basically, here's the size of the head. So you have, let me copy this. You have the head, 2, 3, and 4. So how long the head is, the ears stretch back nearly 3 times as far backwards. And that's a really easy way to keep track of how big these things' heads are. Freaking massive heads, that's what they are. So obviously you get to have fun with the way the head is positioned and kind of how that works in your mind. And this is absolutely something that I can see people drawing a little bit differently each time, and that's perfectly acceptable. I'm not going to be like a Nazi with how these guys are drawn. I just kind of want to make this tutorial so that people who are drawing them or maybe having trouble with them can have something to work with. That is a poorly done ear, now that I'm looking at it. There's such a huge curve to it. Oftentimes the way I like to draw ears is a little bit less curves to them, a little bit more straight out, and then the curve comes in from the bottom. So if we erase this previous line that I made, you have this shape instead. And then it kind of loops around just slightly. Now, as far as the tear in the ear, and I describe it as a tear, but it's not actually torn out at all. It's just much easier to explain it as a tear. There's no real rhyme or reason as to why they're there, or any huge background story or anything like that. It's just a common thing to have a chunk missing out of the ear. Normally it's their right ear, but it could theoretically be either ear, but I think it'll probably be better just to keep it to the other ears for now. I'd assume that this is the other ear. It could be, this top half of a heart shape. So if we draw a heart in, that top half, boom, there you go, Luvalopes tear. But you could also have little crown or star shape sticking out of it. Or you could just giant circle, just because you feel like it. So as to why this species is a closed species, they're my first major attempt at making a custom species. So I'm putting a lot of care and a lot of effort into them. And it's not really a case of I want to be reimbursed by selling the species and selling them, but I want to make sure that all the characters made in this species are controlled and are well made. And that's not to say that people aren't going to make well-made species, or well-made Luvalopes. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, there are some people that I am letting make their own Luvalopes. I'm just kind of telling them if they're doing something terribly, terribly wrong with the design. But it is not a case of me being totalitarian and controlling. I just want to make sure that all the ones that are made are well made. I mean, look at how much effort I put into these things so far, and this is just a small bit of it. I mean, these things are my kids. I want to make sure that they're all very well taken care of. So, with that, I'm probably going to put up this skeleton just onto my DeviantArt for Affinity and such. I'll probably link those down below so that you can see these yourself in a more higher res version, and see them static as well without pulling up a video and pausing it just so you can see it. I don't know if you'll be making a whole lot of use from this skeleton, as it is kind of a very rough skeleton made, but for the people who do get use out of such things, I will have that down below. And with that, I think that just about covers it. I covered a lot of things. This is kind of a long video and it's a very dense video, but it was one that I didn't want to do in multiple parts since, that would kind of clog the channel for a bit. So anybody who's interested in the Luvalopes can obviously work with this video. If anybody is interested in this species as a whole, you can note me or message me on any service listed down below. If you liked the tutorial and you like what you saw, thank you. I mean, it's wonderful. If you have any suggestions for tutorials in the future, say different hairstyles or even different ways to draw species, because I think this is the first time I've talked about a species in particular, and that is something that I'm willing to do in the future. But if you have any suggestions for tutorials in the future, please, you can either leave a comment down below, or you can message me on any site listed below as well. And with that, I think that's everything. Thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.